Hello and welcome to the Poetry Pea podcast, helping you find your weekly scoop of haiku and S9E poetry. I'm Patricia and it's lovely to have your company. Before we get started, a little reminder that this month's Poetry Pea video prompt is live over on YouTube. Our guest editor, Matt Snyder, is waiting to read your poems, so do pop over and leave them in the comments beneath the video. You can submit as many poems as you like, but they do need to be in the YouTube comments to be considered. Matt will be choosing his favourites for publication for the next Poetry Pea journal, and one or more may also be featured on a future Poetry Pea podcast. So, if you've been wondering whether to write something, this is a gentle nudge. Now then, if you were listening last week, you'll know I had very little idea what this week's podcast was going to be about. Well, actually, I had been sort of planning to bring you the work of one of my favourite poets. But while I was gathering my notes together, I stumbled across another poet entirely and took something of a detour. The poet whose work I'd like to bring you today is someone known for haiku, but also a poet whose work is sometimes, shall we say, haiku adjacent. She, for it is a woman, has written some beautiful lyrical haiku, and somehow, despite all these years reading and writing, I'd never come across her work before. Her name is Anne McKay. I wonder, do you know her poetry? Well, if not, I hope you're in for a treat today. Anne McKay was a Canadian poet born in Ottawa in 1932. And during her lifetime she published 20 books of poetry and received numerous awards, not only in her own country of Canada, but also in the US and Japan. From what I've read, she seems to have been a wonderfully generous poet, a prolific correspondent, and someone who clearly delighted in writing collaborative linked verse. Michael Dylan Welch describes her beautifully. He says that Anne McKay performs magic with the words she chooses. Her verses are frequently lyrical, replete with adept repetitions, smooth flow, and an enigmatic transcendence. There is a substance behind the pleasure of Anne McKay's words. Yet, the sound alone is a pleasure. A link to that will be in the show notes. Well, that last little bit, the sound alone is a pleasure, is music to my ears, as you can imagine if you've been here before. You know how much I enjoy poetry that comes alive when read aloud. The rhythm, the sound, the feel of the words themselves. But there are other aspects of Anne's work that really caught my attention too. You know, she has a remarkable awareness of space on the page. And she uses almost no punctuation, at least in the poems I've read. Now, I'll confess, that's not always my preference. I tend to think of haiku as poetry that, as I've already mentioned, lives in the spoken word as much as on the page. And I rather like a bit of punctuation when it helps shape the rhythm or gently guides the reader through a poem. But one of the joys of reading poets whose work differs from our own is that they make us reconsider our assumptions, even if you then stick with them. Anne McKay certainly did that for me. The questions I ask myself aside, there is such musicality in her language that I find myself reading her poems over and over. So today, let's spend a little time with Anne and her haiku and see what you think, how you feel when you hear them, and what's going through my mind when I read some of them to you. At the mission clinic, the woman's winter fingers winding gauze. At the mission clinic, the woman's winter fingers winding gauze. Anne McKay from her book A Cappella. Now, did you notice the poem drops us directly into the moment, into a space? There's no framing or interpretation before the experience begins. With the opening line, at the mission clinic, we know exactly where we are. And I've spoken a lot recently about suggestion and association, and this image of the mission clinic brings with it considerable emotional resonance. To me, it evokes poverty, charity, vulnerability, and care, but without stating any of these explicitly. The second line functions to shift our perspective. The woman's winter fingers. And now we're looking at a person rather than a place. Anne has marvellously used the keygo winter for its associations. Literally, we think of it being cold. But winter also suggests aging, a journey toward the end of life. So we do have further emotional resonance. Now remember what I said about Anne using the space on the page. And in this instance, she's indented the final line, winding gauze, by quite some way. If you're not a Busan or ISA member and therefore don't get the poems dropping into your mailbox following the podcast, there are some links in the episode webpage so you can go and read the poem. So my question to you would be, did she need to indent that line so far? Let's have a think. What she's done is to literally create a lot of white space on the final line. What does that do? Well, if you're only reading it on the page, your eye movement echoes the slow, careful motion of winding the bandage. You could also say that the white space itself begins to resemble the strip of gauze. So if you're merely reading the poem on the page, it works. But if you're listening to it, does it matter? Well, possibly not. Particularly if you read the poem as three utterances. And I would encourage you to go and read Sean O'Connor's essay, Haiku Rhythm and the Arches of Makudo, which you'll find on the website of Presence magazine. Again, link in the show notes. In it he writes, "In haiku there is ma in the rhythm. The silences at the end of each of the first and second lines." Professor of English at Kobe College, Hirai Masako, states, "When reading haiku you should pause after 5 syllables, and again after the next 7, in order to enjoy its rhythm. These pauses, typically occurring as Hirai Sensei describes, are expressions of ma." Now in Sean's essay, we're told that the first pause is 3 times longer than the second, but now if Anne had punctuated to suggest the longer pause at the end of the second line, the person reading the poem aloud would probably achieve the same effect that the long break on the third line suggested. So in my roundabout way, what I'm saying is, if you're reading the haiku and the haiku is punctuated, Anne would not have needed to indent that line so far. I suppose a counter-argument would be that the indentation is in itself a punctuation. Something to think about. But no matter my questions and reservations on punctuation, do you enjoy the sound? Let's have a listen to it again. At the Mission Clinic, the woman's winter fingers, winding gauze. Whether you agree with the punctuation or the indentation, we have a slowing of the rhythm, which, it seems to me, softens the action in the poem. And so rather than a brisk medical procedure, the process we're now witnessing is more tender, isn't it? And whether you punctuate or indent the line, you have white space in each version. And that white space can serve to add meaning. Let's change the seasons and the mood and continue onwards. For one bright moment, the damselfly, impossibly blue. For one bright moment, the damselfly, impossibly blue. Anne McKay, From the Upper Room. Wind Chimes Press, 1990. Into water iris. Wild finch. Yellow on yellow. Into water iris. Wild finch. Yellow on yellow. Anne McKay, At Mull River. Wind Chimes Press, 1995. Echoes come keening soft as a willow over still water. Echoes come keening soft as a willow over still water. Anne McKay, At Mull River, Wind Chime Press, 1995. And possibly you could argue this isn't haiku. Where is that key go? Does it have one? I think in some ways Anne keeps you guessing about it, but if you mull over the poem, read it to yourself time and time again, and think about that willow, we perhaps have our key go there. Echoes come keening soft as a willow over still water. And she, kneeling beside the little death, unaware of snow falling. And she, kneeling beside the little death, unaware of snow falling. Anne McKay, From the Upper Room, Wind Chimes Press, 1990. Now she has punctuated this one, but I'm not sure the punctuation works because it's an ellipsis at the beginning of the first line. So yes, okay, the punctuation does work, but in terms of reading it aloud, fairly pointless. Still a lovely poem though. And a haiku. We have that snow falling, which gives you added poignancy to kneeling beside the little death. Before we carry on, I'd like to ask a wee favour. Asking for support never comes naturally to me, you know that. But if you enjoy the podcast and you'd like to help keep Poetry Pea growing, there are a few ways that you can. You can become a member over at Buy Me a Coffee, or simply buy a coffee, or in my case a ginger tea, or donate via PayPal. But you can also just leave us a review, or tell a fellow poet about the podcast, or volunteer to help out. Every bit of support, whether financial or simply just spreading the word, really does keep me creating these podcasts, and the journal, and the videos, and everything else that goes into the Poetry Pea community. Thank you. It means more than you could know. But let's get back to my favourite bit, and probably yours, the poetry. Following father's deep snow steps, single file, to Sabbath service. Following father's deep snow steps, single file, to Sabbath service. Anne McKay from Haiku Sans Frontières, 1998, edited by André Duhaime. And you can find an analysis of this poem by Dougal J. Lindsay on the Mainichi website. To allow you access to it easier, I'll stick the link on the show notes. However, I'll summarise it, if I may. You definitely have a clear image in this poem. That family trudging through the snow to observe the Sabbath, single file. You're immediately in the scene with them, even if you've never trudged through snow to church. You'll understand what the poem is showing you. McKay has chosen her words carefully for us to make associations. The father has deep snow steps, which suggests a lot of snow, but also that he is a large man, a real presence. And what do you make of the words single file? Lindsay suggests that we might find the father figure to be controlling, the family outing to be something like a regiment on parade. For me, I find it takes me to a line of ducks following their mother, and that softens the image a little bit. Did you notice the alliteration? We've heard McKay use it before in some of the other poems, and I'll read this one again in a minute so you can concentrate on it. Lindsay tells us that this adds to the rhythm of the words and draws us into the poem, without the feeling that the words are contrived. Lindsay says more about the way McKay has used the syllables in her words to great effect. So I recommend you have a read of the whole piece. See if you agree with him. Following father's deep snow steps, single file, to Sabbath service. Anne McKay from A Cappella. Pampas, paler than moons, feathering the river's edge. Pampas, paler than moons, feathering the river's edge. Anne McKay from At Mull River. A mosaic. Yellow ochre, russet and brown, leaves laid in ice. A mosaic. Yellow ochre, russet and brown, leaves laid in ice. Anne McKay from the Upper Room. And I'm going to end the podcast with a haiku. And I'll explain why I think it qualifies as a haiku in a minute. But anyway, a haiku that begins in a very unusual way. Let's hear it, and I think you'll see what I mean. And the river lilies, tall cream blooms, wild in a blue sun. And the river lilies, tall cream blooms, wild in a blue sun. Anne McKay from At Mull River. Okay, so as I said to you before, some people have said that McKay writes haiku-adjacent poems. So is this one a haiku? Does it have a kigo that, in placing us in a situation in time, connects with us emotionally? And I think yes. The seasonal image, the words, lie in the second line. Cream blooms. Yes, the kigo can be more than one word. It can be more than autumn or spring, winter or snow. Why not? So the combination of the cream blooms and the third line, wild in a blue sun, take me to early summer and all that summer means to me. Holidays which equate with freedom, the warmth of the sun on my skin and the joy it gives me. Colour and light. And I could go on and on. Anne's addition of the word wild in that third line. Well, if I go back to the idea of holidays, especially childhood ones for me, when as a city kid I could roam wild on my granny's farm, you can imagine how that increases the joy I feel in the poem. Myself and the cream blooms down by the river, wild in the summer. So that's why I think it qualifies as a haiku. But in this poem, I really wanted to highlight more than just the kigo. We've seen it in another of the poems I read to you. This one begins with the conjunction and, which is unusual, and we're often told not to start a haiku in that way. But I immediately feel like I'm in the middle of a conversation or an experience, and I'm engaged. Are you? This and creates for me a sense of continuity, as though the river lilies are one more element in a landscape the observer has been quietly absorbing or talking about to a friend. I also appreciate the phrase, the river lilies. Rather than simply saying lilies, the addition of river anchors the flowers in their habitat, and we have a panorama before us. We have a plethora of associations roaming around our brains. Where does yours go? For me, river lilies evoke flowing water, reeds, dragonflies on those lilies, reflected light and the rich biodiversity of a riverbank. I get the idea of flowing water, which equates with continual change and purity. The fact that these river lilies are blooming suggests to me that they're not totally new, they're growing, they're showing their beauty, and all that ties in, for me, with the final line, wild in a blue sun, taking me back, as I said, to my childhood summers on that farm in Ireland. And then I'd like to highlight something that perhaps we don't think about enough. Forgive me if I'm wrong, but articles. Here, McKay has used the definite article, the. It's in reference to the river lilies, indicating that these are not any old river lilies. They are the river lilies. They are familiar and maybe important to her. And I think this increases the intimacy of the poem. It's as if McKay is showing us something really important to her, something we should take note of. The phrase, wild in a blue sun, right at the end, stops you in your tracks, doesn't it? I so wanted to read wild in a blue sky, but it's not the sky that is blue, it's the sun, which really unsettles my perception. As I mull it over, I can think of a couple of possibilities for a blue sun. Are we experiencing the sensation of dazzling light suffused with blue, such that we see an intensely clear summer day in which the sky and sunlight merge into one luminous blue experience? Or are we seeing the sun, and therefore the blooms, reflected in the river, taking on the colour of the river, and that enhances the wildness of the blooms as they change in the ripples of the flow of the water? The word wild works on two levels. It tells you and I that the lilies are just that, uncultivated and growing where nature intended. Yet at the same time, it suggests something exuberant and untamed. This poem is static. It takes place in one environment, in a moment. But there is movement that reflects that of the river. You see, as readers, we're given an image to ponder, those static river lilies. But as we progress through the poem, in the company of McKay, those river lilies become more than static. They move in the flow of the river. And also for me, they move in time, literally and figuratively. So I enjoyed this poem. And I wonder, did you? And the river lilies, tall cream blooms, wild in a blue sun. So what do you think? Was this last poem one of your favourites? Or was it one of the others? Or even, do you have a McKay poem that you'd like to share with us that I haven't read today? I'd genuinely love to know. And don't forget, I'll put some links in the show notes so you can read more and more of her work. One of the joys of reading haiku together, is discovering how differently the same poem can resonate from one reader to the next, or how different poems speak to each of us. While you're in a poetry frame of mind, don't forget to have a go at this month's video prompt. Come and visit me and the cows in my alpine valley in Switzerland. And of course, leave your poems in the comments for this month's guest editor, Matt Snyder. I can't wait to see what you've been writing. If, on the other hand, you've come to us late and you've missed the alpine view, unless you're listening in December, there will be another one that you can write for, another video that is. You can write as many poems as you're inspired to write, but remember, we are looking for haiku or senryu, not haiku and senryu adjacent poems, not a combination of haiku and senryu. If you're a Buson or an ISA member, you'll receive the poems we've talked about in this podcast in your email, so you can spend a little more time with them. If you're not a member, don't worry. I've put the links in the show notes so you can read these poems and more. As for next week, I have half an idea where we're heading, but if past experience is anything to go by, I may well disappear down another rabbit hole before then. One thing I can promise is that there'll be more poetry waiting for you. Do join me again next week. It's always a pleasure to have your company. But until then, keep writing. And don't forget to explore those links in the show notes and spend some more time with Anne McKay and her beautiful poems. Ciao.